City planning. You hear about it all the time. Are you going to Planning Commission meeting? What does the planning office say about that? Does the city plan allow for that? But what is it? I'm Brent Bateman, lead attorney in the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman, and your Luau Land Use host.
And I'm Will Summercorn, the Regional Planning Director for Salt Lake County.
We're here to answer the big question, what is planning?
When our nation was young and beginning to grow, life was pretty simple and pretty stable. Cities and towns were relatively small and bucolic. Sure, there was growth and change, but it was pretty familiar and not all that fast.
History buffs remember this well. The Industrial Revolution. Towns and cities began to change in much faster and in much different ways. It wasn't just homes and farms anymore.
Big new business enterprises started showing up, and they needed people, often lots of people, to run them. People needed places to live that were close to the factory, and everything got built close together. These new industries burned lots of wood and coal. There was soot in the air, and waste got dumped in the water around them. Many cities became rather unpleasant places to live, even dangerous. Those who could afford it fled the cities and lived in the nicer, safer countrysides outside of these awful city environments. People started to rethink what they were doing, which led to the City Beautiful movement. Cities needed to become places that people could enjoy living in, more beautiful, pleasant, and safe places. The movement grew, and many cities around the nation established their own City Beautiful commissions and boards, made up of concerned citizens.
A brand new breed of experts started showing up, the land use planner, just like you, Wilf. Some of these new boards and commissions would hire professional planners to advise local groups and even produce new city plans.
Let's talk about one city specifically. It was one of the worst urban environments at the time, New York City. It was a big city that was attracting industrial businesses. They had a constant supply of workers because immigrants were coming into New York by the boatloads. The new industries created a polluted environment. The new immigrants needed homes, and they were built property line to property line, sometimes with only a small enclosed court in the middle where people dumped their wastes. No windows, no light, no air, and waste dumped right next to their homes. In 1916, New York City enacted a new ordinance that established degrees of setback for buildings. It's a standard that states how far a structure has to be from a property line. With setbacks, it was possible to have better light and fresh air flowing through these buildings. Different degrees of setback were created for different areas of the city, or zones, and hence the first zoning ordinance was born. The concept soon expanded with regulations on the kinds of land uses that would be allowed in certain zones. These were often based on those City Beautiful plans.
Other cities copied what New York City was doing and made their own modifications.
The zoning concept grew in popularity around the country as a way to improve the living environment of cities. In 1921, before becoming president, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover appointed a committee to develop a model code for states to adopt that would establish a uniform legal framework of land use planning and regulation.
That was the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, which later changed to the Planning Enabling Act.
And it was adopted by most state legislatures and served as the template for how land use regulation was done at the state and local government levels. The Utah State Legislature adopted the Standard Act in 1925, and Salt Lake City became the first city in Utah to enact a zoning ordinance a year later.
But even with the wide adoption of zoning at this time, the whole legal foundation was somewhat shaky until the year 1926.
Exactly. That's when the U.S. Supreme Court took up a case from the village of Euclid, Ohio, just outside of Cleveland. A landowner, the Ambler Realty Company, was challenging the local zoning code, which restricted the kinds of uses that were allowed in different zones on their land. The Supreme Court upheld the zoning concept as a legitimate exercise of the constitutional police power, intended to protect health, safety, and welfare of the village's residents. The concept of zoning and land use regulation and planning was now secure.
So, what does that mean for Utah today? We'll have to back up a few years. Wilf?
In 1992, the entire state code regarding land use regulation was renamed the Land Use Development and Management Act, the acronym LUDMA that we often hear planners use these days. This act beefed up the concepts of a general plan, and better defined the rules for public notice and public hearings. It also introduced the requirements for designation of a land use authority and an appeal authority. So let's take a look at how local planning and land use regulation is supposed to work under the structure that's been set up in the state code. Every city, town, and county in the state of Utah should have a planning commission. Why a planning commission? It's required if a jurisdiction wants to do any land use regulation. It all has its roots in two things. Remember those City Beautiful boards and the commissions we mentioned earlier? That's one.
And the other has to do with political reform.
That's right. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a lot of citizen disgruntlement with the state of affairs in state and local government. In many cities, it was the people with money and businesses who controlled exactly who got elected and what they did while in office. The same situation existed in state legislatures, which were often controlled by big business interests such as the railroads and the mines. A whole political movement grew out of this situation, called by different names like reformers or progressives. They wanted to take control of elected officials back to the citizens.
In fact, because of this movement, actions of elected officials could be challenged and overturned by the citizens themselves.
Well, the same concept carried over in land use planning and regulation. The elected officials no longer had all the power. Before they could take any action on land use plans or ordinances, they would be required to get input from an independent group of citizens, the Planning Commission. The concept embodied in the State Enabling Act now existed all around the country.
Since planning commissions are so central in local land use planning,